Start the recording. Thanks, April. For today, we actually do not have a cart writer. And so just want to mention that we've enabled the transcript. And so we'll have to use the Zoom transcript that's available. And I apologize that we just don't have a cart writer. We've been really diligent about that and do everything we can to have cart writers, and we will continue to do so in the future. So like I said, we're very excited to welcome you here today to get started with our new IEP as sort of the main event for today's discussion, but we do have some updates as we get started. And then I will, after the updates, just go through the actual form itself. We'll share it with you, tell you more about how we're getting it up on our website today and what we will do to support the implementation of the new IEP, both through professional development and technical assistance, as well as funding support just shortly down the road. And plenty of time for Q&A at the end, as always. So just to start with, we're excited about a job fair that's coming up. This is not solely special education related, but DESE will, along with MassHealth, hold another job fair on April 12th. So in the presentation for today, we've included this QR code that has two options to it. Both if you're an employer, how to register, and we will support you in getting ready for the job fair once you register. There's some steps we'll take to get you just, really well and able to, meet with as many candidates, hear from as many people locally as you can and regionally. As well as you'll see on the right there for job seekers, a separate QR code for them to register to be able to attend the job fair. So we really want both, obviously, employers and potential employees. So please use these resources and help to get the word out. Really excited about what's coming in just a couple of weeks. In addition, just want to mention that we are working to support MassHealth as they work to continue to keep coverage in place, health insurance coverage through MassHealth for families who are eligible, for families who've been receiving this benefit. MassHealth continued its benefit without interruption throughout the pendency of the COVID pandemic, but now we're at a point where families do actually have to take a step actively to renew and continue their membership. And so there'll be an effort throughout the remainder of this spring to continue to get families registered. We're putting a link in the chat that would encourage you to use to communicate with your families, hopefully. One, to tell them that as appropriate, reminding families to look for a blue envelope that will be coming in the mail. We'll be sending on some flyers to be able to use locally as well. And then, just anything you can do to just share the link and share the information with families so that they have uninterrupted services for themselves and for their children. Some families will be automatically renewed, particularly those any children who receive, for example, Social Security income, SSI, will be automatically renewed, but we don't want to take a chance. It's such an important benefit. So we just want to do everything we can to keep that in place for our children as we go forward. So thanks for anything that you can do there. I'm going to now turn it to Jamie Camacho, our Director of Special Education Planning and Policy, to talk about the state application, the IDEA state application that we will be posting later on today. Jamie, please.
Thank you, Russell. So we will be posting the IDEA state application for funds for next fiscal year. So this is the application that the state submits to USCD so that we can actually get our IDEA funds. We do this every year. You probably will get a notification from us today from our updates. You'll see it as a news update on our website. But this is the link. This is where you can find it. Just a little bit of information about this. It'll be posted for 60 days. We take public comment for the first 30. So that's the date, April 24th is the last date that you can submit public comment on this. Just like last year, we don't have the allocations for this next federal fiscal year. So any kind of information on funding, so including the description of the use of funds, which you'll see is posted, is all based on last year's allocation. So we've been informed that we're going to receive increases for both the 240 and the 262, but we don't know exactly what those numbers are. Once we get that information, we'll update that, we'll repost it, just to be clear that the clock doesn't start ticking again for public comment. So we still will only take public comment until April 24th, no matter when we post the new allocations. So you'll see a little bit later today, I don't think it's up there just yet, the cover letter that will go from Russell to USCD, the submission statement that we always post, the description of the use of funds. Again, that's based on 2022, not 2023. And notification of higher standard. This piece is basically anything that we require in Massachusetts that goes above and beyond the federal requirements. And then this last piece is new, and I just want to kind of mention this briefly. This is called the GEPA statement. We will have to submit this as a state, and it just talks about different things that we're doing to ensure equitable access for students with disabilities. You'll also have to do something very similar to this when you actually submit your LEA application to us. So just planning ahead, when you start getting ready to think about the application for your own LEA application for this next fiscal year, state fiscal year, both of them, I guess, you're going to need to be ready to submit not just the assurances to us that you did last year. The GEPA statement is also going to need to be submitted on an annual, not necessarily on an annual basis, but submitted this year. We'll have more information on that, but I just want to kind of put that out there so that you can plan ahead. Russell, is anything else that you want me to talk about as far as the state application?
No, Jamie, that was great. Major headline is posted today for public comment, and then we'll have more direction for you on any changes, such as the GEPA statement when we release the grant funds proposal.
And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. All right, so now on to the main event for today. And so the new IEP form that we are here to talk with you about. I'm going to actually escape here and go here. All right, so this is what's going to happen next. I want to share with you the, let me just stop sharing and start sharing again, just to make sure you're seeing the right thing. There we go. All right, so today we are releasing two important documents. One is the updated meeting invitation, and the other is the IEP itself. And so I'm going to start with the meeting invitation. April, can you let me know, are you seeing my screen? Because I'm not seeing the green box that usually tells me that I'm sharing.
I can see the screen, and it looks like the invitation is up right now.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
If you could zoom in a little bit, Russell, I think that would be helpful.
You got it. Thanks, April. How's that?
Great.
Okay. All right. So today I want to share with you the updated meeting invitation as well as the IEP itself. Just walk you through, how to understand the new forms, the major changes that you will sort of get to know as we grow into these new forms, and of course to take any questions that you have. So reminder, use the Q&A function in order to submit your questions, and we'll be glad to answer any that we can at the end of today's meeting. And of course, this will be an ongoing conversation from here on in about how we're implementing the new forms. Let's start with the meeting invitation. The major change to the meeting invitation is this information about interpretation and translation for the meeting. So two options that sort of come up at the beginning is interpretation and translation and interpretation needed. So it's an or here. So not needed, you would check this box. If it is needed, then we check both the box to say that there will be interpretation provided for the meeting, as well as translation of the IEP materials. So it's an or leading to, if the answer is yes, that interpretation is needed, then we would also want to make sure that translation is provided as well. So that's the main change to the meeting invitation. So just want to put that out to you to begin to think about. Let's go to the IEP itself. And as we get started, I just want to remind you again that the expectation for implementing the new form does not go into effect until the 24-25 school year. You can adopt and begin to implement the new form during the 23-24 school year. That is certainly an option, and it's available to you. But we know there are many issues that need to come together, not only just for those of you, and the vast majority of our districts do use an IT solution. So, the IT vendors will update their IT solution. And of course, there needs to be training for staff. So if you're ready to go for the beginning of the 23-24 school year, that's excellent, but not required. We are fully anticipating that most of our schools and districts are going to implement for the 24-25 school year. And before we close today, we're going to share with you a survey so that we can begin to hear from you about what are your initial thoughts. on when you plan to implement so that we can continue to adjust the professional development to support you with implementation. But let's go take a look at the form. April, I'm going to make it bigger so that people can see it well. Is that pretty good?
That's good.
All right. So let's just get things started. So the IEP begins with the statement of concerns. That is very little change here from what you're used to on the current IEP. If you recall, in the we've released different versions of this as we've gone to get public feedback on. Our very first version, we tried to, very first draft of the new IEP, we tried to embed the parent concern statement, which is federally required, into the IEP itself a little later on. We had overwhelming feedback last summer to make it its own section at the beginning of the IEP, just like we do now. So no major change here. Really what's changed essentially is we shortened the question. We made it briefer than how it reads right now, but it's the same question, same idea. Then we go to the student vision. And this is really important. This begins to signal what we want to have to be different about IEP meetings. And it's really starting with the student vision and getting the student voice up front right from the beginning of the process. That really sets the tone for how the team should be thinking about supporting the student through the IEP. And as you can see, we've differentiated that the student vision would be different for students ages 3 to 13 versus students who are of transition age, that they would state their vision using different prompts. And I've been really gratified and really excited to hear from special ed leaders from across the state who, seeing earlier versions of our drafts, began to use this in their IEP meetings, even with children as young as 3. And it was so exciting to hear their feedback to us about what's possible. And again, it goes back to the theme that I mentioned before we started the recording of presuming competence, that our youngest children can express themselves. Our students with the most severe disabilities can let us know through what they want to tell us about their vision. And, I think an important theme as we continue to go forward is the idea that preparation is not predetermination. So in many cases, there would likely need to be some preparation before the meeting to hear from the student, to get their voice, to answer this question about, what their vision is for themselves prior to the IEP meeting. In many cases, we hope that as many cases as possible, we hope students will attend the IEP meeting. We actually hope this creates more of an opening, more of an invitation for them to attend, because we're going to hear from them first. Once we hear about the concerns, we're going right to their vision. And so we hope that this sort of helps to sort of incentivize and entice students to come, because we're putting their vision front and center. And we are, just making sure we record it briefly right here. We're also getting, a key theme to the new IEP is embedding the transition planning form. So once we implement the new IEP, once it goes fully into practice, again, the requirement being for the 24-25 school year, we would no longer use the transition planning form. And so we're trying to reduce the redundancy that exists right now between filling out the vision on the transition planning form and then having to copy it into the IEP by just saying, let's just make sure we're coming back to this for our transition age students and recording their thoughts about their future here. Then notice that the next thing that comes up is just the team vision response to the student's vision. So we don't want to run contrary to the student vision. We don't want to say that there are two separate visions. The student vision is the voice that we are putting the highest priority on, and we're allowing and inviting other team members to give us their feedback on, well, how do you respond to the student's vision and how would you build on that? So it's sort of a yes and effect to the student vision. So we're pretty excited about that kicking off the IEP process and really being front and center to just getting the IEP started. Then we come to really a section that defines the profile of the student. How do we understand this student as a learner? How do we begin to prepare for what accommodations, what services, what supports, what goals we might have for the student by better documenting our understanding of the student and documenting the conversation that happens in the IEP meeting. So first we start by asking about the student's disability or disabilities. And notice that on our form, we're not asking for primary or secondary disability. We know that's a requirement for significant disproportionality. Our current form, though, does not ask for primary or secondary, nor does this one. We want to make sure that we check all that apply, because we want to think about the student holistically. What are the combination in some cases of disabilities that we want to be thinking about holistically as we begin to plan for the student. The other really important thing, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about our support that we're providing for IT vendors as they provide you your IT solution for implementing the IEP, is that based on different selections that you make here, let's just say, for example, that you select that the child has autism. I'm going to show you in a minute, there are the 7 required autism questions through state law that have to be on the IEP. Our business rules for our IT vendors tells them that if you check this box, those questions should show up. If you don't check the box, the questions don't show up. And so we want to make sure that we are using this in order to define some of what will be prompted for later in the IEP. There are certain disabilities that have certain requirements in either federal or state law that are considered during the IEP process. And we're just trying to embrace that here and think about how do we do that meaningfully through the IEP process. So that's just the beginning of understanding the student profile. The second piece that we want to get to right away is whether or not the student is an English learner. And right now we feel like that's sort of not given the full attention that we want it to have. And it's very purposeful that we make this the very next question, because we think it's so central to understanding the supports that are needed for children if they are duly identified as being an English learner and a student with disability. And so we get right to that question about whether or not the student has been identified as an English learner. And then we have 2 prompting questions. But like I mentioned before, if the answer is no, we expect these prompting questions not to show up at all. We know that there's going to be some feedback about the length of this form. And so I'm just wanting to show you that through the interactive features that we intend to have built in, that if it's relevant and important, we want it to show up. We want there to be commentary. We want there to be discussion about, for example, students who are duly identified. But if that does not apply to this student, we want the team to be able to move on and get to the relevant parts of the IEP that do matter for the student who they are discussing. So again, we start by asking about student disability type and then English learner. And then another overarching question is whether or not the student requires AT, assistive technology devices or services. And again, if the answer is yes, what you're going to see as a theme throughout the IEP is that if we identify a special education need for a student, such as the need for assistive technology, the team is simply prompted not to begin to elaborate here, but to identify where is this going to show up in accommodations or goals or on the service delivery grid or under additional information, how the team is actually implementing supports related to this identified area. So again, so if you were to click yes, that the student needs assistive technology, and it might be that the student is getting some accommodations and there are services, there's consultation from an AT consultant, for example, for this student, that we would be able to click both and then, get to that one, signal that this will be like a thread that runs through the IEP, that we pick it up here and then continue to comment on it as necessary, so that again, we continue to respond to the whole needs of the child throughout the IEP process. Let's move on to the present levels. So we're used to describing the students' present levels of academic achievement in the IEP. This is, again, a required section of the IEP, but how we've organized it is different. And I'm excited about this. I'm excited about what it can mean for our children because it's a different way of approaching the present levels. So notice that there are some more sections. I'm showing you right now the academic section. There are 3 more to follow. I will show you them in just a second. But remember that we're only asking you to complete the sections that apply to the student. So if the student, for example, has a learning disability and does not have behavior or communication needs, this would be primarily the area where you would comment on the student's present levels of performance. And notice how we're doing that. So we think about which area of academics apply to the student. And so we can check those that apply, and then describe the student's current performance, their strengths in relation to those academic areas, and then the impact of the student's disability. And I think this is a really key area where we hope to kind of, help to evolve the practice that we have in place right now about describing a student's present levels and really thinking about how does it matter for the IEP. So again, as we are very familiar with on the current IEP, we comment on a student's strengths, interests, and preferences. That's required. That's, in IDEA, we need to make sure that we do so. But I would argue that the way that we do it right now, where we talk about it, it doesn't sort of, as much build a strengths-based IEP as maybe we would like to. And so by connecting the strengths directly to the area that we're commenting on, we think that we can help teams think about not only, what's the student's current performance and maybe where some of their needs are, but also what are some of their specific strengths relative to this aspect of their learning, in this case, academics. And we hope that this is also an area where we do a little less of the bringing information directly over from the students' evaluation reports, if it was an initial evaluation or a reevaluation, and do more to summarize what was discussed at the team meeting, or briefly, much more briefly, hopefully, bring together some of the information from those most recent assessments. Those assessments were developed for the purposes of eligibility. They weren't developed for the purposes of writing an annual update on the student. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing in information that is timely and relevant, but also user-friendly. And I would argue that when we bring over so much information from students' evaluations, it's not as user-friendly as trying to use these categories to hopefully describe the students' present levels in a more user-friendly way for parents in particular. So you'll see again that we've got this idea here of, this is going to repeat about current performance, strengths, and impact. You're going to see these same three categories show up again as we scroll down. Notice that again, like I mentioned, if you were to identify the student as having autism, then autism-specific questions are going to begin to pop up. And these are the 7 required questions again. Here's the first one. It relates to this question about academics. And so we put it here so that as the team is talking about the student's academic performance, if the student has autism, that we connect this question to that discussion and determine if the student needs any supports in other sections of the IEP. On the next page, we go on to more information about the student's present levels, such as whether or not the student has any behavioral, social, or emotional needs. So we, again, trying to think of this in a more kind of logical way, because there was a lot of feedback on that. When you saw earlier versions of our work, you said, how do we make sense of this? That we've got a required bullying question, and we've got autism questions that relate to bullying, and we've got a required question around behavior in IDEA. How do we make sense of all this? So we did try to organize this so that similar topics are discussed at the same time in the IEP meeting. So again, if behavioral, social, emotional apply to the student, you would provide this information. If it doesn't, you would write an A and move on. And again, we organized and grouped the autism specific questions here, and then asked again that question of where might we see further follow-up in the IEP to support those areas. Next up is just communication. And again, similar format, only filled out as necessary for the student. But then notice that we do ask specific information about the use of augmentative and alternative communication, AAC. And also I want to point out to you that we have an asterisk here. So let's talk about what the asterisk means. Everything I've shown you so far is required under state or federal law for us to include in an IEP. This question is not required. There's no legal requirement for us to include it. But again, when we went out for stakeholder feedback, we got a lot of feedback to say, to ask that we include more information about supporting students' AAC needs in the IEP. And so this is a recommended feature, but not a required feature. And we have a footnote. We try to limit our use of footnotes, but we thought this one was important that we point out that this is recommended but not required. And we hope that, as recommended, that teams will consider this. And we know that, the need for our AAC is more limited. This is not, associated with high incidence disabilities. So I fully expect that for many students, we would select no, and then these questions would not show up. But if we select yes, then we just want to think a little further about how will we support the student's AAC needs through the IEP process. And then finally, we have just an additional area. If there were present levels of performance that should be commented on relative to the students' activities of daily living, their health, hearing, motor, sensory, vision. We included all of those right here, again, as necessary. For some students, the response recorded here would be NA. For others, there would be important information. And like I mentioned earlier, there is information that's required to be included for students who are deaf or hard of hearing or blind or visually impaired. So again, if you had selected those as disability types at the beginning of this section, these questions would show up. If you didn't, they would go away. And then finally, just notice that another example of something that's recommended in the IEP but not required is this consideration about orientation and mobility. There's nothing in legal statute or regulation that requires us to consider O&M, but as long as we were considering other supports for students who are blind and visually impaired, we felt like it was important to pull in O&M. And I just want to reiterate that, this really came about through all of the stakeholder engagement that we've been doing for the past many, many years to know what did people want to see in the IEP, and this was an important one as well. Let's go on to the next section, which is about transition planning. So like I said, transition planning will be included in the IEP as opposed to a separate document as we go forward. And what's important to know is everything I'm about to show you would only show up again for students who are of transition age. Now you can begin transition planning sooner than students who are 13 turning 14 and 14 and up. So our business rules for the technology providers is that the team would be able to manually add this section of the form if necessary, if they want to, but it wouldn't automatically pop up unless the student is of transition age. But again, similar to what we saw above, what's the student's current performance, strengths, and impact of disability? Where will this be commented on further in the IEP? But here, and a lot of what I'm showing you right now has been in our earlier versions. There's sort of a fine tuning here, but not a wholesale change to what you've previously seen in what we've released. So we do want to make sure the team is talking about what type of completion document is the student working towards. Had a lot of feedback on this about how do families know if the student is on a graduation path or not. We want to make sure that that is discussed and then documented. What's the course of study that's going to help them get there? How are they doing relative to those requirements? A question that's required for transition is about community and interagency connections. In an earlier version that we put out of the draft IEP, we asked this question for all students. And we got a lot of feedback to say, I'm not sure about that. Some concerns and questions about how exactly would that be done for all students. This is required for transition age students. So instead of requiring this for all students, we're only including this in the transition section, again, meeting a statutory requirement. And we embrace it. We think it's important, but we think it's clearer for students of transition age than it is for students who are younger. We then want to record what decisions have been made about the transfer of rights when students turn 17. And if there's anything that the team needs to know about decision making once the student is of the age of majority, once the student is 18. And then the last thing about transition planning is just a few questions that we have about supporting the 688 referral process. We know that since the pandemic, the overall referrals for 688 have gone down, and we want to sort of help teams think through how do they plan for 688 referrals. And so we just have a few questions that we ask teams to consider. And a lot of these things on the transition planning form, once they're done, they would just be, relooked at, see if there's anything that needs to be tweaked from year to year. But, and I think it's important to stay on top of transition planning from year to year. But once a decision, for example, about 688 has been made, it's done. You don't have to do it again. We want to make sure that we just have it here so that it can be thought through as necessary. The accommodations and modifications, this looks very similar to previous versions that we've released, except that we condensed the number of settings that we were considering so that there just aren't as many listed here as in previous versions, but this should look pretty familiar if you've looked at any of the earlier versions of the IEP that we've released. Same with modifications, important that they're both here. This, accommodations and modifications going together is something in special education we're very familiar with, but just a different way of trying to organize the information. This really meets sort of national models of describing students' accommodations and modifications. And so there are a lot of resources we can pull in to help teams develop their description of accommodations and modifications for students. Another really important change is we moved up the discussion about state and district-wide assessment right under the accommodation and modification section. Because right now it shows up so much later in the IEP. We thought it was important to more closely marry these together because they should be thought of as a whole. That what we're doing instructionally should relate to what we're doing from an assessment perspective, and so we've just put them right here together. And a lot of the types of questions that you're familiar with. So again, how does the student participate in state or district-wide testing? If it's on demand with accommodations, we would list the accommodations here. And again, we're imagining dropdowns, just like what you use now. Or if the student will participate in ALT assessment, that we describe which ALT assessment the student participates in. And remember, this can be an and. A student could participate in some tests on demand and some through ALT. And so we want to make sure we allow for both. And so that's what we've really attempted to do here. Moving on to the goals. Again, this looks pretty similar to what we've released previously. The goal area, the baseline, target, and you can see these other sections here. This is not changed a lot because a lot of our feedback was positive about this in earlier versions, and hopefully just helps to capture a lot of what teams are doing anyway as they think about the criteria and the method, for example, that we're just working to record it here. As we get closer then to the service delivery grid, I just want to point out to you that we very intentionally moved up what is currently called the non-participation justification and put it before the service delivery grid, because we really want to again work towards students being able to be educated in the least restrictive environment. And so the non-participation justification as written right now, coming after the service delivery grid, and sort of, describing, justify why the student can't participate. We truly wanted to flip that and say, let's start by thinking about the extent to which the student can participate in the general education setting. So, there's language that's required that we kind of worked with here to be able to have that description here. Before we get into the service delivery grid. One of the things that I'll mention in just a minute is that there are some formatting changes that we will continue to make to this form. We are not making content changes, but there are some formatting changes. So for example, we intend for this service delivery grid to read with A, B, and C services, just like it does now. So no change away from A, B, and C services. But this version that we're releasing right now doesn't show that. And so we will release an updated version that shows very deliberately, we don't want there to be any question about what's happening with how services are organized, A, B, and C. And so that will come back. But again, this actually should look pretty similar to what you've seen in earlier versions. So I won't say too much more about that. Notice that we are adding transportation just under service delivery because transportation, if a student requires transportation as a related service, we wanted it to be thought of, close to the discussion about services and related services. So, we brought together both what's required federally and through state law, state regulation here. In this section, it should look fairly familiar, but there's some important tweaks that we made to this in order to hopefully be as clear as possible about transportation supports and services. I promise I'm getting towards the end. We then include the schedule modification, and right now, the IEP reads about whether or not the student needs a shorter day or a shorter year or a longer day or a longer year. We felt like, including the idea that a student might have a shorter day or a shorter year seemed to almost put that out there as something that we think should be in some ways almost commonly considered. We think it would be a fairly exceptional consideration. It does happen. And there is the requirement is actually in our state regulation to have the team think about whether or not the student requires a different duration to the school program. And so we chose to clue into that word duration as opposed to prompting for shorter day or shorter year. For example, we opened up the question a bit more just so that, we're not seeming to incentivize something like a shorter day or a shorter year for some, most of our students really need that full day of instruction. And so instead, we ask about the duration of the day. Does the student need a different duration? And so, for example, if the student was to receive ESY services, we're used to providing some information about ESY, what are the student's disability related needs, and then what is the change to the program. But notice, and we've been talking about this for a while, we've included a service delivery grid specific for ESY. There's just a lot of confusion about where do ESY services go? Do they go on the main grid? Are they described in the current ESY section? So we're hoping to standardize this because I know that as a former special education director, the way that my teams wrote ESY services was sometimes not exactly the same as maybe another community. And if I had a student move in, it's sort of hard to know what did the previous team mean by what they wrote about the students' ESY services and what should they be getting, and how do we sort of translate that here to what we're doing and provide the right services for the student. So we think that it'll be helpful to kind of make it a more consistent consideration across the state if we just have the service delivery grid right here. And again, just like we talked about last spring, we do need to think about transportation for ESY separately from transportation for the school year. And so we do have prompting here for ESY transportation services that would be a consideration unto itself, and really just hoping to clarify that because I know that there's been different thinking about this that we just want to make sure we cut through and are very clear so that we can really direct students and families to the conversation that we need to have about ESY transportation services. I promise I'm right at the end. So we have the additional information section, not a huge change there. But the final thing that I just want to mention and share with you is that through our stakeholder engagement, we received some feedback that we didn't actually go seeking, but it was, that was sort of the beauty of doing as much stakeholder engagement as we did, is that people came with ideas that really enhanced our thinking about the IEP. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got was about partially rejected IEPs and what to do about partially rejected IEPs, because sometimes it's sort of hard to know exactly what a parent is stating when they partially reject an IEP. And we wanted to make this sort of easier and more accessible for parents to understand what their choices are as they think about accepting or rejecting or partially rejecting the IEP. So what we've added is this component about if the the team is proposing a service that the family doesn't want, that the parent doesn't want, that they would select that they don't want the student to receive the following service that's being or service or accommodation, whatever it might be, from the IEP that they don't want to have. Or is there something that the team has said that they're no longer recommending for the student, but that the family wants to preserve from the previous IEP? So both might be true. I know I used the word or, but I should have used the word and. The partial rejection could be for both in some cases, but we just wanted to make it a little clearer for everyone involved about what is the parent's intention, and to make this clearer for the parent about how they express their intention. So that's basically a quick overview of the form itself. that, look forward to just continuing to get your feedback on as we go forward. I'm going to just stop my sharing real quick and go back to my PowerPoint. So bear with me here and share my screen and then put it in presentation mode. Great. April, just want to make sure you're seeing the right version on the screen.
Yep, we got the punch list.
Excellent, excellent. So what I was, while I was talking, I was saying that, for example, there are some formatting things, some stylistic things that we still want to improve with the IEP. And we want you to have it now. We didn't want to continue to, adjust formatting or stylistic types of aspects of the IEP and hold this up any further. We really wanted to make sure that you have it as immediately as possible to begin to get to know it. And again, we're not expecting immediate implementation, obviously not this spring. And even, again, I'm just going to say it again, that we fully anticipate that many schools and districts are going to wait until the 24-25 school year to implement. But the journey begins now, right, as we understand it and begin to absorb the changes that are coming. So there are some minor formatting and stylistic improvements that we will continue to make to the form, but we will not change the overall content. I've had this question has come up a lot from special ed directors in particular, saying, you're going to release it, but then are you going to keep changing it? And I think we need to get used to the new content. And so we're making a commitment not to change the content at this time overall, but there might be some technical adjustments. And I just want to be open about that. You might read this and say, why did you consider this verb, for example? Would you consider this verb instead? So, as we release this to you today and knowing that there's some small adjustments we're going to make on our punch list, we are open to considering technical adjustments, but not wholesale changes to the content. So again, at the word level, we are open to making some changes, but not at the overall content of the IEP. And we want to be very transparent about when we make any revisions, not only the date when the revision occurred, but also providing you, likely through these meetings, exactly what did we change, so that we're just really clear, really transparent about any changes that we make. We also have a strong commitment to just regularly coming back to this IEP and looking at it. I think one of the challenges with releasing a new IEP today is that we haven't really changed a lot in at least 22 years. And so, I think this needs to be the type of thing that we come back to and revisit, not immediately. We want to get going, again, with no content changes with this current form, but on a regular basis, come back and see, what do we need to change? What do we need to improve? And so I'm, excited for you to get started with the new form. And I think, again, change is challenging, especially when we haven't changed a form in such a long time. And I think one of the main things is that this is an opportunity for us to think about how we run IEP meetings. And I know that with a lot of things in education, if we don't let go of some of our current practices, it's hard to make room for new practices. And when I think about the old IEP having been in existence for so long, it's almost like, I don't know if any of you have had the experience of moving from one house to another after you've lived in one house for a while, or apartment, or wherever you might be living. You accumulate a lot of things. And in this case, we accumulate certain practices that have been in place over the years. And I think this is, hopefully a good opportunity for us to look at how are we running IEP meetings right now? Because, currently the IEP, it should be the agenda for the meeting, as the new IEP will be as well. And, there are times that we, the IEP process can begin to look a lot, in some ways, like a parent-teacher conference, and not as much following the agenda of the IEP. And so I think this is hopefully a good opportunity for us to, as we're preparing for getting ready for the new IEP, is really to look at our practices right now and to ask ourselves, are we staying close to, the questions that are in the current IEP to help us develop the best IEP we can for our children? And if not, what adjustments can we make now in service of a new way of, doing business when we implement the new form? I want to just transition to talking about the business rules that we are releasing today for the vendors. because we know that there are things that we can do to make this as efficient and effective as possible when we implement using IT solutions. We challenged ourselves to think about how can this form exist without an IT solution, because not 100% of districts use IT solutions. And so we wanted it to be that you could pick it up and use it, fill it out, just like you saw me doing on the screen. And we want to make sure that where districts, and again, the vast majority use an IT solution, that the IT solution can help to make the process flow as clearly as possible. So like I said, if a student has autism, we want those autism questions to show up. And what we've done is we've written very clear business rules. It's actually about 60 pages of business rules that we're releasing today, so the vendors can follow that and know how to make the form, most effectively operationalized. And we're really excited about that. But along with that, what I would say is that we want to make sure that we can answer your vendors' questions directly. And part of the challenge of that is that we don't communicate directly with the vendors. We don't have the contracts, obviously, you do. And so what April's putting in the chat, if I'm correct, is that we're providing you with some stock language to use with your vendors, to invite them to the meeting that we'll be holding on April 5th from 3 to 4 o'clock in order to answer their questions. And we want to be very transparent about what we discuss in that meeting. So we're going to post the questions and answers that were discussed on our website. April, I'm just looking to see, great, you've put in the chat, the email. So again, I just want to be really clear. We will be challenged to get to all of the IT vendors because we don't have relationships with them. So what we're putting in the chat right now is language that we hope you can cut and paste. Maybe if you primarily contact your vendor through a helpline, maybe just pasting that message into the helpline. If you have a connection with someone who is your IT vendor, somebody you contact regularly through email, maybe you could just email that to them. But we want to get the word out far and wide that we're holding this meeting, and we just need your help in getting the message to the IT vendors. So we are grateful for your support in getting that word out, and we hope you can use the stock language that April just provided to you in the chat. April, I'm pleased to turn it to you now to just talk about the professional development and technical assistance that we will provide.
Great, thank you, Russell. So we're really excited to let you all know that we're partnering with American Institutes for Research, AIR, who has a tremendous amount of experience and tools in their toolkit around implementing a new IEP. They recently worked with Connecticut, who's been rolling out their IEP for the last few months now. We are beginning to plan for training, which will include various forms of professional development and technical assistance. But before we do that, Russell mentioned earlier, it's going to be really important for us to have an idea of how many districts will be rolling out in the 23-24 school year versus the 24-25 school year. So we will be sending out a brief survey. It will come from one of our staff in the SEP office, Bob Hannafin. It will come to the special ed leaders only. And we're hoping that you can get back to us as soon as possible, because that will really help to guide our planning around the provision of technical assistance and professional development. In that survey, we will also be asking you about what your priorities are and gathering information about the types of professional development and support that you will need throughout the school year beyond just the IEP form, but really getting into gathering some information from you about what are the most current needs that you have in your schools and districts. So it's kind of asking two kind of questions that are really important to us moving forward. What you can expect from PD and technical assistance is that for the 23-24 school year, as Russell said, we anticipate that few districts will be rolling out next year. So we will have the opportunity to provide some technical assistance that will be needed for those schools and districts. We will have a Train the Trainer Institute, as I've been calling it, which will consist of live sessions. For those people who are doing it for the 23-24 school year, that will likely be a webinar format, virtual format. For others, we plan to have regional training, so one in Western Mass, gotta represent, one in Central Mass, and one in Eastern Mass. And really, these are designed to allow individuals from your district to become the experts and to start envisioning and creating a plan for the rollout, which will include the professional development that you'll need to provide in-house to your staff. But we will also be providing a slew of asynchronous tools and resources that we are hoping you will be able to utilize in your schools and districts to provide some of that training and technical assistance yourselves, and some turnkey tools and resources that you might be able to use to communicate the changes to the members of your community and your stakeholders, parents, families, caregivers, school committees, etc. This year, we are going to be holding office hours in the end of April and sometime in May, and that really will allow you to kind of get familiar with the forms and bring your questions and concerns to those office hours, which will be held by AIR and DESE in collaboration with one another. You can be on the lookout for an invite to that, probably the last week of April. Lastly, next year, as we get into the bulk of the training for the majority of districts, we will be offering regular office hours, probably every other week or monthly, and that will really depend on the need that you all express to us. So we're really trying to be responsive to the needs of your individual districts as we're planning the training in TA.
Excellent. Thanks, April. Appreciate that. Jamie, talking about the funding support that we might have available.
Sure. So there will be some financial support from the department to help you with your rollout. Once she mentioned the survey that's coming out, once we have a better idea of how many districts are going to be rolling this out in the fall and how many will probably be following the following school year, we'll be able to give you a little bit more information on specifics on the grant funding. It will be grant funding. We'll try to make it as simple as possible, but it'll be available to you no later than FY 2024, so no later than the summer. And it will be available to not just school districts, but also the approved special ed and collaboratives.
Excellent.
Anything else, Russell?
No, Jamie, I appreciate that. I know that you've got some questions queued up, and it seems like one of the main ones is where will people be able to access the forms?
Yeah, so we are going to, I think April's going to drop in the chat. We expect at any time the forms will be posted on our website. So we'll give you that information in just a second. There it goes. So you'll be able to find it. We're also sending out a special ed updates today. So the information will be there as well with the link. There'll be an announcement on our website. And I would expect you should be able to see that very soon. So that it's going to be live soon, Russell. Sounds great.
Sounds great. Today's the day. Thanks, Jamie. I know we have about 4 minutes, so just want to see what other questions you want to raise.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions, I think, because there's multiple forms in the IEP. So things have come up about the placement page. So can we talk a little bit about what will be posted today and some plans